lot of definitions of terrorism are incredibly broad and would basically cover anything that rebel groups do, that if you are a rebel, you are a terrorist, and so I need a more narrow definition. So my definition of terrorism focuses on a systematic choice to use deliberately indiscriminate attacks against civilians. So not targeting somebody specifically because you think that a rebel group thinks that that group is collaborating with the other side or to try to pressure them to collaborate with their own side, but things like bombing a marketplace or bombing a bus, things where ordinary people go who are going about their ordinary business. And it's a way of trying to get at the fact of deliberately targeting innocent, right? So not people who you think are involved with supporting the other side, but anybody going about their daily business could be a target of an attack. So that's how I'm trying to separate terrorism from other types of violence that happen in civil war, certainly distinguishing it from violence against targeting military targets, but also other types of violence against civilians, because civilians get targeted in all civil wars in various different ways, and I want to hone in on this very specific, indiscriminate type of targeting. So in effectiveness, I'm trying to get at kind of ultimate effectiveness. So a lot of the literature talks about the effect of terrorism on intermediate types of goals, like mobilizing public support or mobilizing recruits, or getting one's grievance on the international agenda. And I think all those things are important, but if they're important towards a larger end, and I want to focus on the effectiveness of achieving that larger end. So I think about it in terms of achieving ultimate political goals, and the way I capture that empirically is to look at the outcome of a civil war. So if wars, we could think of a continuum of outcomes. If a rebel group wins outright, rebel victory, that's the best outcome, that's the most effective from a rebel's perspective. Second best is a negotiated agreement. So a negotiated agreement in some ways means that both sides are giving up some of what they want and getting some of what they want, but rebels are fighting to change the status quo and governments are fighting to maintain the status quo. So a negotiated settlement almost always moves things away from the status quo in the rebels' preferred direction. So that's the second, not quite as good as winning outright and being able to dictate the terms, but second best. Then at the other end of the spectrum, the worst outcome from rebels' perspective is being defeated militarily, so a government victory is the worst outcome. Second worst are wars that kind of fizzle out, and in almost all cases they fizzle out because the rebel group has been essentially defeated, not eliminated, but essentially defeated. And then in the middle, I think about wars that are ongoing. A lot of the debate in the terrorism literature about effectiveness revolves around whether an ongoing war is considered a success or a failure from the terrorist perspective, or the rebels' perspective. And I think that's a silly way to think of it because it is neither full success nor full failure. It's something in the middle. So that's why I think of this along a continuum. Yeah, so this is one of the most surprising things that I found so far, and I think it may be, I should give kind of a caveat first, it may be because I'm looking at full-scale civil wars, so I'm selecting the strongest groups. So within that range of groups, I'm not seeing that the stronger ones are less likely to use terrorism and the weak ones are more likely to use terrorism. When I look at a larger scale, which I'm hoping to do with new data, I might actually find more support for this argument, but so far I'm finding no support for it, and it's kind of the most prevalent, almost cliche kind of explanation of why groups use terrorism is because they're weak. So to answer the question, I think that weak groups, whether or not they use terrorism, is driven by the same reason other groups think about using it. They think about the costs and benefits of using it, and they think about what effects it'll have on popular support for their cause, on whether it'll cause the government to crack down on them too brutally or crack down on them just the right amount, and they'll be able to provoke a kind of the kind of response that'll generate them more support. So I think that they're thinking about it the same way that strong groups are. What's more puzzling is why strong groups use terrorism when they seemingly don't need to. And I think some of it may have to do with thinking that it's a relatively cheap way. They're using it along with other kinds of tactics. It's a relatively cheap way to impose pain on the civilian population and thereby influence the government. I think there may also be something in which groups kind of get stuck organizationally. They start using terrorism, then they know how to do it, they have expertise in it, and also they've already been sort of tarred with the terrorist brush, so they're already paying the costs of using it, and even if they cut back on how much they use it, they've already sort of paid those costs, and so there might be organizational reasons to keep doing it once you've started doing it, even when you've become really strong. So I think that rebel groups have to think about where they're going to get basic things that they need to launch and maintain their rebellion. So they need recruits, they need support, they need guns, they need money, they need all these kinds of things, and they can get them from several different places, and they're not mutually exclusive. They often get them from many places at once. And so they can get them from the civilian population, they can get them from outside, they can get them from another state that sponsors them as a way of undermining the government they're fighting against. They can get them from diaspora populations that care about the cause that they're fighting for. Or they can, alternatively, or in addition, they can finance their war through crime, running drugs, conflict diamonds, gems, drugs, the lootable commodities, basically. So I think that groups that rely predominantly on the civilian population, or to the extent that groups rely on the civilian population, they'll be constrained from using terrorism because the negative effects of terrorism affect the civilian population. By definition, it's attacks on the civilian population. And groups that use lootable resources, crime, gems, etc., are the least constrained because those commodities don't care about legitimacy, right? They don't care whether humans are getting killed or not. They'll still come out of the ground. But in the middle are groups that rely predominantly on external supporters, diaspora or external state supporters. And there, I think whether or not rebel groups are restrained or not restrained from using terrorism depends on what those groups want. Sometimes a diaspora population is more extreme in its political beliefs, and also because the diaspora population doesn't suffer the effects of the conflict. They're willing and encourage more violence than local civilians. Sometimes an external state supporter, part of what they want is the destabilization that killing a lot of civilians entails, because they don't actually care about the cause the rebels are fighting for. What they really care about is destabilizing their neighbor or their rival government. But sometimes international supporters really do care about whether civilians are getting targeted indiscriminately, because that makes them look bad if they're known to be a supporter of that rebel group. So I think that these externally supported rebels, whether diaspora or state support, fall on average in a middle category, but whether they are restrained or not restrained depends on the preferences of the group that's supporting them with respect to terrorism. Yeah, that's a good question. So this is one of the things that's kind of puzzling, because in general I find that terrorism is not effective, and yet it gets used. And so why is that? But I do find that wars in which rebels use terrorism last longer than others. So there seems to be a benefit of using terrorism for organizational survival. So I think there are often cases where I think most rebel groups, maybe not all, but most actually start with legitimate grievances and things that they, political goals that they want to implement. But sometimes the running of the organization and those organizational survival goals take over from the political goals. It's kind of good to be a rebel leader, right? Probably maybe better than your life was before. Probably not to be sort of a rank and file soldier, but I think there are the kind of raison d'etre of this group is to fight this fight, and if the fight goes away, then maybe the raison d'etre of the group goes away. Some groups can convert themselves into political parties and do really well in the post-conflict period. Some can't, and particularly groups that have already turned to terrorism maybe have a harder time making that transition. And groups that are funded through loot, crime, and gems and things, they might be lining their pockets in ways that are not possible if the conflict ends, and so they actually have an incentive to prolong the conflict, not to end it. So I think once conflicts get started, even if they were started with sort of sincere political intentions, once they get going, these other organizational things can take over in a way that makes it really hard to end the war. Yeah, so part of the reason I think democracy makes terrorism more likely, given that there's already a civil war going on, is that democracies are, I should back up, if the logic of using terrorism is to inflict pain on civilians and then the civilians pressure the government to make concessions, that's going to work better if the government's actually accountable to civilians than if it isn't. So that sort of causal chain works better for rebels using terrorism against democracies than non-democracies. There's not much that democracies can do about that except become non-democracies, and I'm certainly not going to advocate that. And I should also say that being a democracy makes you much less likely to have the civil war in the first place. It's just that if you have a civil war, you're more likely to be targeted with terrorism. But the other reason that I think terrorism is more effective against democracies has to do with the provocation logic, that autocrats can be provoked into really brutal crackdowns against rebel groups and their supporters, and democracies are more constrained. And so a lot of people talk about this as, oh, this is so terrible, democracies are constrained and we can't really fight the fight really well. But the flip side of that is the other way to avoid making provocation work is not to overreact, right? So I think if the policy recommendation that doesn't have all sorts of other ill effects, like undermining democracy in the first place, is not to overreact. That if terrorist attacks happen, they should be treated as criminal issues, not as wars, and that if governments refrain from attacking the population writ large in an indiscriminate way, they don't get provoked into this overreaction, and so that's not going to drive up support for the rebel group. So I would counsel restraint.